Yes, my alpha, Vibrant Violet. Chapter 3, The High Seas Part 1 by Bottle 7. What ship sails up on stormy seas? A voice sang out in a dank prison. Yo-ho, the Rose Marie. Hubert, or Huey, as his friends called him, sat in the prison in Malachite Port during the modern year 1880. He had been arrested recently, on the charges of obstruction of justice. With white sails and a ship so pink, the voice sang out again, Yo-ho, the Rose Marie. Of which Huey was very aware he was guilty. He was surprised that Hadley's cousins had been smart enough to put it together, though it had taken them a couple of years to do it. Getting up off the bunk, he walked over, looking at the cell beside him. As much as I'm enjoying your singing voice, it's really ruining the mood. He spoke, leaning against the bars. The figure laying across the bunk wearing a captain's hat slowly sat up. The singing stopped and Huey felt the gaze of the figure land on him from under the brim of the hat. My apologies, a female voice said. She lifted up the brim of the hat and seemed to get a better look at Huey. Hubert knew that look in an instant and grinned. Well, she said, adjusting her hat. Huey tilted his head, interested. It was a one-eyed alpha woman. What's a pretty little omega like you doing in a place like this? She asked, getting up and walking over. Huey admired each step the woman took. She walked with a sort of grace and confidence that Huey liked to see in people. She walked over, standing on the other side of the cell wall, looking down at him. Murder perhaps? She asked. Nah, obstruction of justice. Huey replied with a grin. He leaned towards her through the cell bars. What a coincidence, she said, leaning down, her hands over the bars just above Huey's. They were nose to nose now. Me too, she said. Huey grinned at her. Well, no good deed goes unpunished, I suppose. Huey remarked, that's why all the good ones die young, sweetheart. The alpha woman replied. She shifted her grip and Huey saw a mark on her wrist. A pirate's mark, a bright pink pea burned into her skin. So, you're not any good? Huey asked in a flirtatious tone. Depends on who you ask, she replied in much the same tone. Who'd you help? She asked. My best mate Hadley and his gal Laken, Huey explained while he didn't expect much of a response. He then saw recognition in the woman's eye. Well, it's a small world after all, she joked. I help them too, she explained. Huey blinked owlishly in surprise. Really now? He asked. Yeah, good-looking couple those two. Hope they're happy, she said before holding out her hand through the bars. Huey, getting the idea, placed his hand in it and she kissed his hand. Captain Sloane Myers, she introduced herself. Her lips barely removed from the top of his hand. Hubert Thompson. Everyone calls me Huey. Huey introduced himself. Pleasure to make your acquaintance, she said politely. She then let go of Huey's hand. Though I wish it was under better circumstances, she added, finding a seat on the nearby bench. Huey sat down on the other side. Same, Huey replied. Normally I'd ask for a tour of your quarters if it was any other circumstance, Huey said shamelessly. Sloane laughed hearing this. Quite forward, aren't we, Mr. Huey? She asked, amused. I just like being honest, Huey said with a grin. Honesty isn't always the best policy. It doesn't hurt to let a few white lies slip through the cracks every now and again. Sloane spoke. Maybe, but I find I get rewarded for my honesty much more often, Huey teased coyly. Sloane stared at him before laughing. You're quite relaxed for an omega in jail, Mr. Huey, she exclaimed. I could say the same to you for someone with your history, Huey remarked, pointing to her wrist. Sloane paused and held her wrist with a grin. Ah. So, you've seen. Worry not, the P stands for privateer, she teased. Sure, he replied, winking at her. The alpha woman chuckled, finding his flirting amusing. I'm not worried because I have immunity from the crown, Sloane explained, I am a privateer. They need my ship for supplies, nothing ever gets lost when the Rose Marie takes it. Sloane bragged, you have immunity. Huey perked up hearing this, Everyone on my crew does. Sloane replied, turning and leaning up against the cell wall. Huey shifted, can I join? Huey asked, I won't lie, I'm in pretty bad right now. I did end up injuring a constable when I kicked over barrels. Huey explained. Sloane turned slowly and looked at him. It's a crew of alpha women, dearie. I don't think you'd fare well. She explained. Huey sat on his knees and stared at her. Please, I won't complain, I promise. He begged, I'm in need of a job anyway, the Loom House fired me. He exclaimed. Sloane tucked one leg under the other to face him completely. Loom House? She asked. Yeah. I used to work there making fabric and lace. Huey exclaimed, how good is your patchwork? Sloane asked, rubbing her chin. Not as pretty as Hadley's, but it's strong. Huey said, feeling like he had a way out of his mess now. Sloane grinned, if you can manage to sew on a ship, then I can take you on, Mr. Huey. She said, grinning, the girls are needing a lot of patchwork done and have little time to do it themselves. Sloane explained, always complaining about injured fingertips and the like. Frankly, it started getting on my nerves. Sloane complained. Huey stared, well, it's not as if I have any choice. Besides, I'm pretty sure I had a fantasy once being on a boat with only alphas. Huey remarked. Sloane stared before snorting, oh you poor sweet thing, some of the lot are followers of Sappho. She remarked, pardon? Huey asked, they're lesbians, Mr. Huey. Sloane spoke more frankly. A good chunk of my crew are pair bonded with each other. Mrs. Darcy and I are among the few that aren't. Sloane explained, how many others? Huey asked, now you've just been flirting with me, Mr. Huey, a girl could get jealous. Sloane teased. Huey laughed, but worry not, I'm not the jealous sort. I can share if I have to. She said before starting to count, though I don't like it. She added jokingly, just give me a number, Captain. Huey chuckled. 25. Though depending on the time of day. 24. Sloane answered. Why did it go down? Huey asked, exasperated, I get less picky when I'm drunk. Sloane grinned at him. Huey stared before bursting out laughing, you're my kind of people, Captain. He laughed. A bit of a kindred spirit, are we? Sloane asked, yes. Huey replied, chuckling. Just as Huey chimed in agreement, the jailer came in with the chief constable. Sloane Myers, we just received word from Gritstone, you're free to go. He spoke, approaching the cell. See now, don't you feel a bit foolish? I had the seal and everything. Sloane remarked, yes, well, around these parts we often tend to be a more suspicious lot due to history with women of your kind. The constable replied sheepishly. Sloane stood up and dusted herself off. So it would seem, Sloane replied before glancing back at Huey. The two of them made eye contact, and for a moment Huey wondered if Sloane was going to go back on her promise. I'm also going to need the Omega next door. Funny thing, he's a new hire for my crew. Just hired him on before you gentlemen so kindly gave me a tour of your facility. Sloane spoke, motioning over to Huey. What? The jailer said, startled, you can't be serious. The constable pinched the bridge of his nose. Surely to heavens, I am good, sir. I hired this gentleman to be my ship's tailor. My girls need clothes that secure their modesty. Sloane spoke politely and sounded completely honest. Would you leave us women folk in clothes no better than ribbons and our modesty torn to shreds? I understand we're a bit different than a beta or omega lady. But we alpha ladies are ladies all the same. The two men groaned, just take him. The chief constable spat as the jailer handed Sloane a document back. Thank you ever so much, I'll be sure to speak highly of you when I see Duke Hamilton again, Sloane said, grinning. The men glared at her before walking over and unlocking the jail cell Huey was in. Thank you, Captain, Huey said, grinning as he left the cell. Anything for one of my crew. After all, what is a captain without her crew? Sloane said, grinning. Just leave. The constable was completely exasperated by the two. Very well. Another time, then, dear constable, jailer, Sloane said, giving a slight bow before putting her hat back on. Come on along, Mr. Hubert, Sloane called. Huey grinned at the two alpha men before following Sloane. As he left, Huey had only stopped momentarily. He caught a brief trade of comments. Are you sure that you want that changeling to take an omega? It's the town hall, it's not like we're losing a good one. Hubert's smile faded upon hearing that. He started walking quickly only to run into Sloane's back. He looked up and saw Sloane staring at the door, and then they stared at each other. Mr. Hubert, never mind the conversations of pigs. Nothing wrong with having control over your body, Sloane said, taking off her hat and placing it on Hubert's head. You heard too? Huey asked. Aye. Sloane replied, that sort of thing doesn't matter on the seas, by the by, Sloane said, holding out her hand to Huey. He took it and they walked together out of the jail hand in hand. Huey walked with Sloane with her hat on. He smiled slightly, feeling like he and Sloane were going to become good friends. The walk to the docks took a decent amount of time. Within that time, Huey had time to speak with Sloane. So how many are on your ship? He asked. 100, Mr. Hubert, Sloane replied patiently. Why do you know Duke Hamilton? Huey asked. I saved his life and his reputation, Sloane replied coyly. She knew he was curious and purposely kept details to herself. Not going to tell me just like that, huh? Huey asked. What's a woman without a little bit of mystery, Mr. Hubert? Sloane replied. I need all the edge I can get if I'm competing with my crew for your affections, she joked. Huey laughed, amused. Though I should warn you, if you value your life you'll stay away from Darcy, she told him. Why? Huey asked, confused. Her husband can and will kill you, Sloane said, dead serious. What kind of person is her husband? Huey asked, horrified. Someone who loves Mrs. Darcy very much. Sloane spoke as if she was reading off a script. Other than that, anyone who's willing, go ahead. Just try not to get pregnant. A ship isn't a place for a child. If you're in need of liberty tea, let me know and I'll be sure to secure you some, Sloane said casually. You're really okay with me sleeping with people? Huey asked, surprised. 'Tis none of my business what you do with your free time, Mr. Hubert, Sloane replied casually as she walked. Well, Sloane didn't walk so much as she strutted. Also, it's not as if I can be constantly there to stop you, she added. I will warn you, if you offer help during ruts, you will find yourself busy, she warned, with a mischievous grin. Hubert took a moment to consider his options. I'll be moderately generous, he said, grinning slightly. I very wise. Even the girls who are willing to help get tired out too. Sloane spoke frankly. How do you handle yourself during ruts? Huey asked, grinning flirtatiously. Sloane paused and grabbed her hat from Huey, placing it on her head before leaning down. Mr. Hubert, she said, placing a finger under his chin and tilting it up. Careful swimming in shark-infested waters, she said teasingly. You'll get bitten, she warned. Huey's eyes slowly widened as he understood Sloane. The warning was if he were to get into bed with her. Huey swallowed. She'd mark him. I might not be a jealous woman, Mr. Hubert, she said softly, but I don't like sharing if I don't have to. It's even worse if the person I don't want to share is pretty and as coy as you are, she complimented. So, make up your mind. She rubbed her thumb against his lips. If you want to play with the crew, you're welcome to do so, she said, eyeing him. But if you play with me, The two made eye contact. You'll never leave the Rosemarie. She let go of his face. Huey felt his cheeks burning and Sloane smirked. She seemed pleased with his reaction, but another thought occurred to Huey and he blurted out, Did you just say you were going to lock me up? He exclaimed horrified. Sloane was just about to continue walking. The two of them stood there. Are you daft? She said exasperated. What do I look like to you? What kind of psychopath locks up their lovers? Henry V. Huey replied, unsure how to respond. Sloane stared at Huey before laughing. She then locked arms with him. Mr. Hubert, you make me want to keep you. She cackled. Locked up? Huey asked, Is that what you're into? Sloane replied, No. You sound unsure. I mean, I'll try anything once. More laughter from Sloane came soon after. Huey found himself standing in front of the large pink ship with Sloane. Captain's back. Several women yelled as soon as they saw Sloane. Aye. It took even less time this time. She laughed with her hands on her hips. An alpha woman with a green flat cap walked up from a different street just shortly after they had arrived. Mrs. Darcy. Sloane greeted, Captain. Darcy replied, clearing her throat. She looked flustered. I see you had a visit with your husband. Sloane teased. Darcy's face turned red, and she straightened up her shirt collar, not realizing there were rouge stains on the collar. Darcy mumbled shyly. She then spotted Huey. Who might this be? She asked. A friend of our friends Lakin and Hadley. Sloane replied, This is Mr. Hubert Thompson. He is our ship's new tailor. Oh. Darcy replied, I thought he was your new cabin boy. Darcy remarked, heading towards the ship. I've never kept a cabin boy. Sloane said, exasperated. Darcy, what the hell do you think of me? Sloane exclaimed, horrified. I try not to judge, Captain. Old habits die hard, Darcy replied, climbing the ramp onto the ship. Huey watched the situation and snorted. Am I the new cabin boy? He asked innocently. What does that mean I do? He asked, batting his eyes at Sloane, who stared. Come up here and we'll show you. Some of the crew shouted at Huey. Great idea, Captain. Another member exclaimed. If any of you lot lay a single finger on him without his consent, you'll lose your hands. Sloane threatened. There were a ton of groans. Just say he's your lover, Captain. Don't tease us like this. One crewmate complained. False alarm, everyone. One of the women shouted, Captain's keeping this one. A chorus of groans was heard. Now that just makes me sound greedy, Sloane complained as Hubert and she walked up the ramp to the ship. Well, you are pretty greedy, Captain. A young girl said with a snort. Such a mouth on you, Winnie. Sloane scolded. Winnie grinned and looked over at Hubert. The name's Winnie, she said flirtatiously. The man isn't even on the boat and you're trying to invite him into your bunk. Have some class, Winnie. Another woman complained, pulling Winnie by the ear. Bella. Winnie whined. Bella sneered and looked at Sloane. We'll do introductions to Mr. Hubert after we set sail, Ms. Belladonna, Sloane replied. Aye, Bella replied before dragging Winnie away as the young girl whined. All right, ladies. Let's get that ramp up and get out of here before they change their minds. Sloane shouted, AYE. Women sounded off from everywhere on the ship. Sloane climbed up the steps as Hubert stood there. Once at the helm, she turned the ship as the anchor was lifted and sails were lowered. Oh, I forgot my stuff. Hubert suddenly remembered as the ship slowly left port. Never mind your things, boyo. You won't be needing much if you're the captain's boy. An older woman remarked as she tied a rope taut. Why does everyone think the captain and I are together? Huey asked cluelessly. You're wearing her hat. The woman replied. Hubert reached up, suddenly realizing Sloane had put her hat back on his head at some point. When did she do that? He wondered to himself. He looked over at Sloane, who seemed to be perfectly at home behind the helm of the ship. She stood tall and proud, a bandana in her hair keeping it from her face and a grin on her lips. Huey wondered if Sloane had been serious about what she said. "Don't worry, Captain won't force anything on you." A quiet voice spoke up. He looked over and saw Darcy again. "She's not like that. It's just a way for her to show that she cares about you, so the girls will be careful," Darcy explained, taking a breath between her words. She spoke slowly and seemed to be trying to keep from stuttering. Huey smiled at Darcy. She was so cute. For a moment he was tempted, but then he saw the lipstick on her collar and decided he preferred living. "Oh, I'm not worried," Huey replied. Darcy seemed to take his words at face value and smiled. "Good. Some people get worried and jump ship," she said, wringing her hands. "I don't want to have to jump in after you. Liam just got me this shirt," she explained. "Liam?" Huey asked. Several collective groans sounded off on the ship. "That's her husband," Winnie said snidely, clearly jealous. Somehow Darcy managed to bag herself the prettiest omega I have ever seen in my life. Winnie leaned against the railing dramatically. More importantly, he's so in love with her. He doesn't even look at me. "Me? I'm pretty," she complained, motioning to herself. "Pride cometh before the fall, Winnie," Bella scolded, handing her a mop and a bucket. "Clean," she ordered. Winnie let out a rough groan but didn't complain. "Aye," she spat sarcastically before walking off to clean. Huey chuckled and looked over at Darcy. "Sounds like quite the husband," he complimented. Darcy's cheeks turned pink with happiness and the women groaned jealously. "You're disgusting," Winnie shouted across the boat at Darcy before letting out a louder groan. "Why can't I find an omega like that?" she bemoaned. "Shut up and clean, Winnie," Bella shouted, annoyed. Once the ship seemed steady, the helmswoman took the helm and Sloane walked down the steps. "Mr. Hubert, would you mind coming with me to the upper deck? I'd be wanting to introduce you to the girls now that we're out to sea," Sloane explained. "Sure," Huey replied, placing his hand in Sloane's as she walked him up the steps. An unneeded gesture, sure, but Sloane seemed to like leaning into such behaviors, so Huey let her. Once Huey stood on the upper deck with Sloane, the captain shouted, "Ladies," she called. Everyone slowly gathered once there was enough of them. Sloane then motioned to Hubert. "This is Mr. Hubert Thompson. Yes, he is an omega, and he is our ship's new tailor. For those of you with clothes that are ripped and need mending, please seek out Mr. Hubert for his services," Sloane explained. Several hands came up at once and Sloane sighed, taking her hat off of Hubert's head. "Yes, he is single," she deadpanned, and several hands went down. Darcy's hand was the only one up. "Mrs. Darcy?" Sloane asked. "Where are his quarters?" Darcy asked. Sloane opened her mouth and then paused. "That's a good question," she replied. "We can't just have him bunk with the lot of you. The poor man needs privacy for his heat." Sloane mumbled thoughtfully. "Just put him in the captain's quarters, he's just going to end up there anyway," Winnie shouted, annoyed. Several women laughed at once. "Winifred," Sloane spoke, "if you think that's going to embarrass me, then you have another thing coming." Sloane spoke confidently. "Mr. Hubert knows that should he end up in my quarters, he won't be able to play with the lot of you." Sloane spoke smugly. "Isn't that right?" she asked, looking over at Huey, who grinned. "Captain and I already talked about it," Huey replied, unashamed. "Something about shark-infested waters and getting bitten," he remarked, glancing over at Darcy. "Captain likes strange sayings." Darcy deadpanned, looking over Sloane's way of talking. "Bah! Mrs. Darcy, you just prefer your husband's wordsmithing over mine." Sloane waved her off. "Liam is actually good," Darcy replied, clearly proud. Everyone groaned in response. "We know." Several women shouted at once. Their shouts covered the noise of Darcy bragging about her husband. From what Hubert could catch, he had published another book. He wasn't too sure. He didn't want to ask because he got the feeling he'd have to listen to at least an hour lecture about this Liam if he did. Anyway, all this is to say, should any of you play with Mr. Hubert, it should only be done with his express permission and should not affect his work. Sloane explained, that's all. Now if you excuse me, I have to go see the love of my life. Sloane spoke looking excited. The love of your life? Hubert asked amused. Come along, Mr. Hubert, it's time you meet the man in my life. Sloane spoke, leading Hubert to the captain's quarters. Instantly, when the door was opened, a large white bird flew over. Captain, Captain! It squawked excitedly. Sloane let out a laugh and flipped the bird over into her arms like a baby. Diego! She said as the bird screeched happily. Sloane scratched the bird's head and then let the bird sit on her arm. What in heaven is that? Huey exclaimed, this is Diego. The love of my life. This little bird has been with me for years. I adore him. Should this ship go down, he's the only one I'm saving. Sloane said as the bird tried to climb on top of her hat. That's a bird? Hubert asked, surprised. The birds at Malachite Port were tiny save for hawks. This thing was huge. He's a parrot, Mr. Hubert, a cockatoo. Sloane said as Huey snickered at the name. Laugh all you want, that's what his species is called. She said, walking over and setting Diego on a perch and giving him some fruit. She smiled at the bird affectionately before sitting down at her desk. So, we have to figure out where on the Rosemarie you can sleep without being disturbed. She said, pulling out a map of the ship. There were notes written all over it with the names of the crew next to different areas. Sloane pursed her lips and frowned. No, that won't do. I'd rather live. She sighed. What? Huey asked as he was trying to approach Diego. The only available room would be a storage room next to Mrs. Darcy's room. I don't think Mr. Liam would be too happy if I place you there. Hubert gave up on trying to get the bird's attention as it seemed too focused on the fruit it was eating and walked over, leaning over Sloane's shoulder. What about here? He asked, pointing to a small room right next to the captain's quarters. It'd be a short walk. He teased jokingly. Sloane eyed him out of the corner of her eye and chuckled. Don't tempt me, Mr. Hubert, I don't have much restraint. She warned. Hubert grinned and leaned against her. I suppose it's a bad time to tell you that I forgot to get my things. Including my clothes. He said quietly. Sloane took off her hat, resting it on her desk, chuckling. She then grabbed Hubert, pulling him into her lap. Huey laughed, not minding it, and found a comfortable position sitting on her lap. With a smile like that, I'll get you whatever you want, Mr. Hubert. Sloane said, grinning. Now don't tell me that, Captain, I'll bleed you dry. He replied with a grin. Sloane softly caressed his face before speaking. You can wear anything I have until we get to the next port. We'll get you whatever you need then. She said in a relaxed tone. Why specifically your things? Huey asked, grabbing the wrist to the hand caressing his face. Well, if you'd like to wear the filthy clothes of the crew, be my guest. Sloane tilted his chin up. At least mine are clean. Sloane said, leaning close, and you won't smell like the others. She purred softly. Huey felt his breath get stuck in the back of his throat as Sloane leaned close. Sloane was a very attractive alpha, the kind of sort that Huey loved to get involved with. Trysts with alphas like Sloane were passionate and unforgettable. He gripped her shirt tightly as their lips met. Sloane's lips tasted sweet, and her probing tongue had the lingering flavors of citrus. Huey squeezed his legs together around the wandering hand of Sloane that had found its way between his thighs. They parted as Sloane kissed his cheek and neck. I get the feeling you would have done this if you could reach me through the bars. Huey laughed, feeling the kisses tickle his skin. Only if you let me, Mr. Hubert. Sloane purred in his ear. I thought you said that I wouldn't be able to play with you without getting bitten. Huey purred, grabbing Sloane's face and making her look at him. Sloane seemed to be dazed for a moment before focus came back into her eye. Huey felt particularly smug seeing this expression on the captain's face. "What is a little petting too much for you?" Sloane asked lowly. Huey chuckled as he felt her hands graze his groin. "Not at all, long as you can be a lady about it," Huey teased, and Sloane grinned ear to ear. "It seems my reputation has not preceded me," she remarked, leaning in close and kissing Huey again. "I'm nothing but a lady to the fellows I play with," she purred with their lips touching. Hubert snaked his hand up into Sloane's hair. Sloane smiled, kissing him again. Huey was about to shift his position so more interesting things could happen, but Sloane stopped him. "Making me sorely tempted to keep you, Mr. Hubert," she whispered, eyeing him. "I'd take good care of you if you'd let me," she said softly. Huey breathed heavily as she whispered these sweet things to him. They had just met, but Huey was beginning to understand Hadley a bit more. While Huey had been with a laundry list of men if Laken even remotely acted the way Sloane did. Huey stared at Sloane. He'd never want to let go of Laken just as Hadley didn't. It was a sudden realization that made Hadley's running away make more sense. While Huey hadn't put much belief into the idea that alpha women were fey, they did have a way of making you go crazy about them. "We just met, Captain, don't be in such a rush," Huey decided to reply coyly. Sloane smiled at him. "Well, fellows like you only come along once in a while, Mr. Hubert." Sloane spoke before pecking his lips. Huey hummed, kissing back. He felt his lower side ache with need. "Can't blame a gal for being a little impatient," she said, helping Huey off of her. Once Hubert was upright, Sloane stood up and stretched, and Huey stood there blinking a few times. "All right, I'll go work with the girls on getting that room ready for you." Sloane spoke. "Do a good job and I'll give you a kiss," Hubert called as she left, and Sloane laughed. "Mr. Hubert, if I do a good job, you'll have to give me a little more than that," she replied in a teasing tone. "We'll see how good it is before talking," Hubert replied, grinning ear to ear. Huey decided to stay in the captain's quarters, choosing to look around. As soon as he opened the wardrobe, Diego perked up and shouted, "Thief!" Huey turned around. "I'm not a thief," Huey said, offended. Diego bounced on his perch up and down with the fan on his head stretched. "Thief! Thief! Thief!" the bird chanted. Hubert marched over and eyed the bird. As soon as he was away from the wardrobe, he went quiet and stared at Hubert. "So, she taught you to tattletale?" he asked, narrowing his eyes. The bird lifted its foot up and Hubert held his arm out. "Come on," he said, and the bird hopped on his arm. "You know the captain likes me. She said I could wear anything I like," Hubert spoke as Diego squawked, ruffling his feathers. He walked over and opened the wardrobe again. Just as the door opened, he turned around and saw Sloane standing there. She looked surprised. "Well, I'll be, Diego's on your shoulder," she said, amused. "Yeah?" Hubert replied. Diego turned around and squawked, "Captain!" "Thief!" he told on Hubert. "Hey? I thought we were friends," he complained as the white bird flew over onto Sloane's shoulder. Sloane chuckled and fed Diego a peanut from her pocket. "Good boy," she said, grinning. "Diego's just doing his job, Mr. Hubert," she said, chuckling. "Yeah, I gathered, called me a thief," Huey said with mock offense. "Now, Mr. Hubert, don't take this personally. I've just had a few wandering hands on the ship," Sloane explained. "Like your hand wandered into my trousers?" Huey asked, raising an eyebrow. "It'd wander other places far more interesting if you'd let me take you in," Sloane spoke lightly. "Being pushy is not attractive," Huey spoke with a grin on his lips. "I thought you liked honesty, Mr. Hubert." Sloane hit back as soon as Huey had retorted. Sloane walked across the room and put Diego inside a cage, leaving the door open. The bird yawned and fluffed up on the perch. The two of them looked at each other and grinned. "We really are of like mind," Sloane said, amused. Huey felt his cheeks tingle. It was so new to have an alpha be able to be just as witty as him. He was so used to alphas who just wanted their egos stroked and a hole to fuck. Of course, the dumb ones were always pretty good at it, so Huey never really minded. "I suppose we are." Huey said, grinning. "Is my room ready?" he asked. "Of course, Mr. Hubert. Do you think I would return empty-handed?" Sloane replied. "I hoped not," Hubert replied, grinning. Gracefully, Sloane held out her hand and Hubert placed his hand in hers. "Well, I didn't. I want my reward after all," Sloane said, grinning, "even if it's just a kiss." Huey couldn't help but question. He wanted to see her reaction. "A kiss from you, Mr. Hubert, is like a breath of fresh air. So I will take it gladly," Sloane said, leading him out of the room. There was no hesitation in the response and Hubert smiled to himself, pleased. The woman always seemed to have something to say. It was indeed a short walk to a smaller room that Sloane opened up. It was cleaned up and a bed was put in there with a small desk and chair. "Nothing much in here as of right now, but at the very least it's private," Sloane explained. "I also had to do this by myself," she added, sounding annoyed. "Oh, you poor thing." Hubert chuckled, patting her arm. "Yes, I have suffered for this labor, Mr. Hubert," Sloane said dramatically. Hubert chuckled and motioned for Sloane to lean down. He started to lean in to kiss her on the lips but decided to tease by kissing her cheek instead. "Cheeky thing." Sloane laughed unoffended before grabbing Hubert's hand and kissing it. Hubert grinned, pleased, before pulling her face closer and kissing her lips. He hoped to coax her into a bit of fun, especially after earlier. Deft hands snaked around his waist. Hubert pulled himself closer to Sloane, allowing her arms to trap him. They kissed each other deeply, quickly becoming breathless. Hubert wrapped his arms around her, clutching the fabric of her shirt tightly between his fingers. He panted for air, feeling his skin burning and tingling as Sloane kissed along his jaw to his neck. He felt her breath on his ear and heard her voice, soft and low. "What a tricky little thing you are. Trying to lure a girl like me into your bed." Her voice was thick with an amorous tone. "How will I be able to look my future husband in his eyes?" she mumbled softly, placing a kiss on Huey's ear. Hubert chuckled softly, feeling ticklish. "What about my future? Ruining my price on the marriage market, Captain? How terrible," Hubert retorted, pulling back. The two of them smiled at each other, desire radiating off of them. There was a growing giddy feeling that Huey had burning in his stomach. A tingling of excitement that only grew each time they interacted like this. In just a few hours of meeting, they could hardly keep their hands to themselves. There was something so undeniably attractive about each other. Something magnetic that made both of them want to do nothing more than just touch and feel each other. The two of them both leaned close, just about to kiss again, when the door opened to Hubert's room. "Captain." Darcy's voice spoke up. The heated and passionate mood in the room was broken all too easily. Hubert held back a groan, just when things were getting good. Sloane let go of Hubert, standing up, looking surprised for just a brief moment. "What is it?" she asked, unfazed on being walked in on with Hubert. "The wheel has gotten stuck again and Iris can't get it loose," Darcy explained. Sloane adjusted her eye patch and sighed. "Very well, let's get this done smartly then," she grumbled, sounding annoyed. She paused after taking a step and turned to Hubert. "Another time, Mr. Hubert?" she asked in a flirtatious tone. Huey chuckled. "If God be so willing, Captain Myers," Hubert replied. Sloane grinned, her eye lighting up at the response. She opened her mouth to say something else, but the back of her collar was grabbed by Darcy. "Now, Captain," she snapped, jerking the woman back. "Duty's calling," she called as she was dragged off. Once alone, Huey let out a breath. He tried to go over everything that had happened thus far. However, a red mark caught his eye in the small mirror on the wall. He walked closer and spotted smudged lipstick kisses on his face leading to his ear and neck. Wiping them off with a grin, he glanced at the door, feeling very excited to see the captain again very soon.